About 15 years ago, I had a friend and I just felt there was something a little bit off-key about her relationship. I only met her husband once. He was a charming man, but it was more in our day-to-day conversation. I just felt that she was a little bit controlled, and a few years later I felt that she probably wasn't allowed to go out without him. I'm probably completely wrong. She's probably very happily married. I'm not in contact with her any longer. But I just thought this whole idea of control of one person in a relationship, I just thought it was quite fascinating, and I kept thinking I'd like to write a book about that one day. I read newspaper articles. There weren't really any cases because then it wasn't a crime. But I did, look at newspaper articles where women had been kept captive, and even when they'd had the chance to escape, they hadn't, and that told me something about the amount of control they were under. And I thought that was quite fascinating, that even when they could have got help, when they were allowed out to go to the shops, they still went back. And it didn't really occur to them to try and escape until maybe years later, and they thought, well, I could have escaped then. I could have said something to somebody, but I think they thought they wouldn't be believed. And I just found this whole thing fascinating. And when I read those articles, I thought, well, yes, there's definitely, people are going through this, but it's a kind of hidden crime, because domestic violence or physical violence is, people are more aware of that. But I think this mental manipulation is much harder to see and maybe much harder to prove as well. I started writing my book in 2013 and the law hadn't come out then, and so I was really happy when I saw that there was actually going to be a crime. And of course, if I wrote my book now, I would like to interview victims, because I think it would be really good to get their side of the story. But saying that, I was contacted by various women who had been in this sort of controlling relationship and said, Grace's story could be my story. I've had this happen to me. Certain things in the book have happened to me. So I was very pleased about that, because I think I did get it right. I think that when you write a book, you become really involved with your characters. And for this book, I almost felt sometimes it was the characters writing it. I know this sounds very strange, but especially Jack, because I couldn't have imagined what he'd be like, but I did felt that he was pushing the pen. Sometimes when the next day I would read what I wrote the day before, I was really surprised. And I think that's the thing. Of course, I didn't write it all in one go. I would be off maybe having a nice time and coming back and writing. So to get into that claustrophobic mindset, but you just imagine you're the victim and you imagine you're the manipulator. And I think that's how I was able to do it, really. For me, it was easier to be in Grace's position, I think, just because she was a woman and because I could just imagine what it must have felt like for her. For Jack, it was very difficult. For example, the part where he talked about his childhood and the reason why he became, well, it gives the sort of reason why he is like he is. I found that incredibly hard to write, and whenever I reread the book, I never reread that section. So basically I read it twice, once when I wrote it and once at the end before it went off to print. But yes, it was much easier to be Grace. And also in places like work, you can be manipulated as well. So I think everybody in some way has probably had some sort of manipulation where you're told you're doing things wrong even though you think you're not, or you've been told that you've had these instructions but you haven't. And I think a lot of it goes on not just in the house but also in the workplace, and I think you can relate to that to a certain extent. It actually felt the most natural way to do it. It was always going to be, which is probably quite wrong, because I do think there are a lot of men as well who are in these controlling relationships, but for me it just seemed more natural to do it that way around, and also probably more believable in a way. So whether that's wrong or not, but what I would urge anybody to do is just to speak about it, but we don't, because it's very hard, because there's no proof. And I think women, they find it very hard to say to a friend, I'm being controlled by my husband, who may come across as a very charming man. And in my book, I actually gave Grace Millie, because I thought if I just wrote about a couple where the woman could have walked away at any point, people wouldn't have believed it. They would have said, why didn't she just leave? So I wanted an anchor for Grace to make it that she couldn't get away because somebody else was going to be in danger. But there are so many women out there, I think, who don't have this anchor, but they just can't walk away, because manipulation is just eating away at their confidence until they feel they actually can't function without the other person in their life. So I would say to anybody just to get help, just to speak about it. And I think your campaign is absolutely brilliant at bringing this out into the open, and people can say, well, this is happening to me, and now there's somewhere I can go. You know, there are people like you, there are other people going through it, you're not the only one, and please recognise it for what it is, which is a crime, and it is an abuse. And even though there's no bruises or anything, it's mentally, it's abuse of your mind, really.